A Painful Case by James Joyce is the 11th short story published in the 1914 collection titled Dubliners. This realist fiction is set in the early 1900s in Dublin, Ireland. This modernist short story is from the third-person anonymous point of view. Click the link in the description box below for more Dubliners short stories. The protagonist of A Painful Case is Mr. Duffy, who is a middle-aged man who lives alone in a quiet suburb far from the busy city of Dublin. His life is simple, lonely, and very organized. His eyes present the impression of a man ever alert to greet a redeeming instinct in others but often disappointed. Duffy works as a bank clerk, follows the same daily routine, eats at the same restaurant each day, spends his free time alone or at concerts, and only sees his family on special occasions. He prefers this kind of isolated and predictable lifestyle and doesn't like social duties. One evening, Duffy meets Mrs. Emily Sinico, a married woman with a daughter, at a concert. She starts a conversation with him, and they develop a friendship. Over time, they become close, enjoying each other's company and having deep conversations. Mrs. Sinico's husband, Captain Sinico, is often away at sea and doesn't pay much attention to her. He even assumes Duffy might be interested in their daughter, Mary, which allows Duffy and Mrs. Sinico to meet regularly without suspicion at her home. Their friendship changes unexpectedly one evening when Mrs. Sinico presses Duffy's hand to her cheek, which Duffy sees as a romantic gesture. Astounded, he pulls away and decides to end their friendship. Heartbroken, Mrs. Sinico tries to move on, while Duffy goes back to his lonely, predictable life and avoids concerts so he won't risk seeing her. For years later, Duffy reads a newspaper article titled Death of a Lady at Sydney Parade, A Painful Case, which reports Mrs. Sinico's tragic death in a train accident. The article explains that her life had become troubled after her friendship with Duffy ended and that she had started drinking alone at night. It's uncertain if her death was an accident or intentional. At first, Duffy feels revolted, thinking her death was a result of her poor choices, and he feels justified in ending their friendship. But as he sits in a pub reflecting on her death, he begins to regret what happened. He realizes that Mrs. Sinico might have suffered deeply after he left her. He starts to wonder if his rejection led her to loneliness and possibly to her tragic end. Duffy walks through the city in sorrow, reminded of life's connections that he feels he has lost. He realizes that he might have been Mrs. Sinico's only real friend and that he threw away their connection because of his own fears. As he watches a train pass by, he imagines he can hear her voice in the sound of the train and feels a deep sense of loneliness and guilt over his choices. Haunted by the memory of what he let slip away. Now let's look at the major themes of Joyce's A Painful Case. A Painful Case begins and ends with Mr. Duffy alone, highlighting the repetitive cycle of his life that keeps him isolated. His home, chosen for its distance from the lively city, mirrors his personality. It's dispassionate and detached. Mr. Duffy's strict routines keep each day identical to the last, creating a life that's empty of true connection. This predictable existence leaves him spiritually dead even while he's alive, especially after the loss of Mrs. Sinico, who briefly awakened his need for companionship. In her death, she finally exposes him to the emptiness of his life, but this realization is tragic for several reasons. First, it takes a dramatic loss for him to even question his way of life. Second, when he does, he must confront that he played a part in Mrs. Sinico's heartbreak and eventual death. Third, and most tragically, even though he understands the consequences of his actions, he remains stuck, unable to change his life despite the guilt and self-awareness. Mrs. Sinico fully recognizes her loneliness and actively seeks to escape it. She starts her friendship with Mr. Duffy, inviting him into her home and life with enthusiasm. Her daughter is often away with her own social commitments, and her husband, Captain Sinico, spends much time at sea and no longer views her as someone he romantically desires. Feeling abandoned by her family, Mrs. Sinico longs for connection, which ultimately leads her to express affection for Mr. Duffy. When their relationship ends, she finds herself even more vulnerable to loneliness and desperately seeks another escape. Her daughter later reports to the newspaper that Mrs. Sinico had turned to heavy drinking, while Captain Sinico describes her behavior as intemperate over the last 2 years. Whether her death was intentional or an accidental result of drinking is ultimately unimportant. It was loneliness that led her there. Mr. Duffy is lonely because he either can't or won't form close bonds with others. He doesn't even realize how deeply his isolation affects him until he learns that the one person he truly connected with, Mrs. Sinico, has died from loneliness. Before he meets her, Duffy's life follows a strict routine, eating at the same places and spending his evenings alone with books or classical music. After he ends things with Mrs. Sinico, he quickly falls back into his old habits, and only 4 years later does he feel the impact of her loss. Duffy and Mrs. Sinico's relationship is entirely non-physical, yet he has trapped himself in a self-made prison of solitude. Despite his obvious dissatisfaction, Duffy chooses to live this way, staying aloof and moralistic, especially in how he treats Mrs. Sinico. Lacking the boldness to pursue a deeper connection, he only realizes the depth of his loneliness when it's too late. Though Duffy seems content with his solitary life, there are small signs that he wants companionship. When he first meets Mrs. Sinico, he closely studies her face to remember it, suggesting his interest, maybe even attraction. After a few meetings, he could easily let things stay casual, seeing her only at concerts. But he goes further, initiating additional meetings even in her home. After they part ways, he immerses himself in books by Nietzsche, who advocates for total self-reliance, suggesting that dependency on others weakens a person. It's almost as if Duffy is trying to convince himself that he has made the right choice in cutting her off. Duffy's reaction to Mrs. Sinico's gesture shows he's not as self-sufficient as he thinks. He prides himself on following a strict personal moral code, practicing his own form of spirituality privately rather than in a church. Yet his moral choices are influenced by societal norms and church teachings. Though he won't engage in a physical relationship with Mrs. Sinico to avoid adultery, he allows a deep emotional bond to form, making his behavior somewhat hypocritical. Everyone knows of his visits to Mrs. Sinico's house, and while their connection is intellectual, it still crosses a line in her marriage. Duffy's obsession with propriety and conventional morals ultimately keeps both him and Mrs. Sinico from being happy. Hope you subscribe for more Dubliners stories.